Vincent DePaul. Welcome to Tuesdays with Vincent DePaul. We welcome each of you and thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Crank and I support the 750 volunteers, Vincentian volunteers that make up the 29 conferences of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in Contra Costa County. I'm your host, but represent the Spirituality Information Committee of Contra Costa County. As we do with most St. Vincent de Paul gatherings and meetings, we will start tonight with a prayer, and I've asked Claudia to read a prayer.
All right. I'm going to share this on screen so you can all follow along. And I think you will hear once we listen to Ralph's presentation why this prayer is important. It's the prayer for the canonization of Blessed Frederic Ozanam. Lord, you made Blessed Frederic Ozanam a witness of the gospel, full of wonder at the mystery of the church. You inspired him to alleviate poverty and injustice and endowed him with untiring generosity in the service of all who were suffering. In family life, he revealed a most genuine love as a son, brother, husband, and father. In secular life, his ardent passion for the truth enlightened his thought, writing, and teaching. His vision for our society was a network of charity encircling the world, and he instilled St. Vincent de Paul's spirit of love, boldness, and humility. His prophetic social vision appears in every aspect of his short life, together with the radiance of his virtues. We thank you, Lord, for those many gifts, and we ask, if it is your will, the grace of a miracle through the intercession of Blessed Frederic Ozanam. May the church proclaim his holiness as a saint, a providential light for today's world. We make this prayer through Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Claudia. Okay, a couple of quick notes. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, the little checkerboard squares is what's considered the gallery view. And as people come in, normally what we do is we ask people to click on that. And then as the presentation starts, go to presenter view. This will help us kind of get a chance to really get into our presenter. Anyhow, so when we begin the presentation, please put your screen on presenter mode that will enable you to view the presenter in the presentation. The mute audio button, because of the turnout we have this evening, we will mute everybody at the beginning of the presentation. If you're called upon for more information or dialogue about your question, to unmute yourself, you can do this by hovering your mouse over the microphone in the picture. This is the mute audio, is the lower left hand of most screens. When you're not in dialogue with Ralph or Claudia, please keep muted. That way, any background noises will not distract the other participants listening. Questions. You'll see the chat feature on your screen, usually the lower center of most laptops or desktops, a little bit different on iPads. If you'd like to ask our presenter a question, please type your name and question into the chat. Your question will be directed to the tech host for this session. Our tech host for this workshop is Claudia Ramirez, who's Executive Director of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul of Contra Costa County and member of the National Council Board of St. Vincent de Paul, USA. At certain times, Ralph will pause during the presentation and try to answer as many questions as possible. If Ralph is not able to answer any of your questions, we will follow up with you after the presentation. So, Tuesdays with Vincent de Paul. Last fall, the Spirituality Information Committee wanted to find a way to reach out and engage with our members in provide an infusion of Vincentian spirituality. It was a time when many, not most, but many of our Vincentians had to separate from their local parishes or church communities. Tuesdays with Vincent de Paul is the outcome of that effort. It didn't start with us. Vincent de Paul himself began to provide spiritual training every Tuesday to what later became the Vincentian family. Our program consists of a focused bi-monthly study to re-engage, offering a deeper dive into the spirituality, culture, genealogy, and the various arms, religious and laity, founding documents, and iconic art and saints of our Vincentian family. Tonight, we start our first chapter studying the actual birth of what we know as Society of St. Vincent de Paul from its founder, Frederic Ozanam, as we continue our journey to introduce Vincentians to each artery that makes up the arms of the Vincentian family. We could not have found a more knowledgeable person to help us with this interchange, Ralph Middlecamp. I'd like you to provide you a short introduction to Ralph, our presenter for this evening. Ralph is a Vincentian first. He's an Ozanam scholar. He is the national president of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, USA. He's the international board vice president of St. Vincent de Paul for Solidarity and Special Projects, and he participates as the lead of the International Historical Commission. Ralph is a member of the St. Thomas Aquinas Conference in Madison, Wisconsin. He served as an executive director and CEO of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul for the District Council of Madison from 1999 until his retirement, July 31st, 2017. Ralph began his career with the Society in 1987 as a store general manager. During his 30-year tenure, the number of stores increased to 7, and he developed a Center for Vincentian Charity. Ralph has served on the National Council of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's Store Committee and Communications Committee. He is on the presenting team for the Society's National Leadership Renewal Program and the Invitation for Renewal. Ralph is a past member of the International Council's General Commission for the cause of canonization of Blessed Frederic Ozanam, and in 2017, he was elected National Council President. Ralph is married to Dr. Kathy Hurt Middlecamp, who is on the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies faculty at the University of Wisconsin. Ralph, thank you so much for joining us. And at this point, I'll turn the meeting over to you.
But first, we're going to mute everybody and then ask Ralph to unmute, please.
So it's good to be with everyone this evening, and it's a great series that you've all put together, and part of the tradition of the Vincentian family, going all the way back to Vincent, to educate ourselves, to become deeper, have a deeper understanding of this vocation we all have. So this evening, I'm pleased to be able to have a discussion with you about Frederic Ozanam, our principal founder. The title of the talk this evening is Following Blessed Frederic into the Vineyard. And I'm taking that theme of following Blessed Frederic into the Vineyard as part of looking at Frederic as a model for lay spirituality and holiness. I give many different talks on Frederic Ozanam, and I use different lenses. There's so many different ways you can look at this amazing man. And tonight I'm going to be looking at Frederic Ozanam through the lens of being a model of lay spirituality. And I'm going to use in particular the apostolic exhortation that John Paul II, St. John Paul II wrote in 1988 called Christi Fidelis Laeti, which is the beginning of the first paragraph called The Lay Members of Christ's Faithful People. It gives us a way to look at Ozanam as a lay person, as a layman, in which he lived an extraordinary life, which can be a model for all of us. I'm going to use that as an outline and say, look at his character. So the apostolic exhortation, which is a letter, it's one shy of being an encyclical. It's got one downgrade under the encyclicals that are written by the Holy Fathers. And this is looking back at the documents of the Second Vatican Council 20 plus years later, and re-examining the documents of the council on the laity and John Paul II's views on what it is today. So he starts that exhortation saying, the lay members of Christ's faithful people, Christi Fidelis Laeti, are those who form that part of the people of God, which might be likened to the labors in the vineyard mentioned in Matthew's gospel. The council fathers, re-echoing the call of Christ, have summoned all the lay faithful, both women and men, to labor in the vineyard. Now, as I read that letter the first time, I started picking up on some themes that really matched what Frederic Ozanam was writing many years earlier. And so we start off with, and Frederic often uses this same motif of the vineyard to talk about his own vocation. I don't know if the Holy Father copied from Frederic, but it keeps popping up different times that they use some of the exact same wording. So as a very young man, this is several years after our founding, he's writing to his friend Lallier, one of the other principal founders. He says, however useless servants we may be, it is not permitted that we be lazy servants. The reward is only given on the condition of the work that we will be doing in the vineyard of the Lord, in the place which will be assigned to us. So right from the start, Frederick's seeing that his vocation is really one of servant, and it is the model of the servant in the vineyard. All the way through his life, obviously had this, because in 1850, now 2 years before he died, he's still using that model when he writes to another friend. He says, I wished to dedicate my life to the service of the faith, but all the while considering myself as the useless servant, the worker of the last hour, whom the master of the vineyard accepts only through charity. So he has that sense, and there's a humility there too, isn't there? That he, even though he's an accomplished person at the end of his life, he still sees that he's the servant in the vineyard. So that's the model that the Holy Father had presented for us as lay people from the gospel. And that's the model that Frederick had. A little further on in this letter, then John Paul writes, we come to the full sense of the dignity of the lay faithful if we consider the prime and fundamental vocation that the Father assigns to each of them in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit, the vocation of holiness. That is the perfection of charity. Well, we all know, baked into our rule, especially in part 2, this whole concept of a vocation of journeying together in holiness. And when the rule talks about Frederic Ozanam, one of the first things it says is that the spirituality of one of its founders inspires Vincentians profoundly. Blessed Frederic Ozanam attained holiness as a layman through living the gospel fully in all aspects of his life. 2 things to pull out maybe from that little part of the rule. It's the part where it looks at the spirituality of the society. And 2 things. One is it identifies Blessed Frederick as someone that inspires us. So during this talk this evening, part of the purpose is to think, who is this guy? Who is this man who is supposed to inspire us? What is about his life that is able to inspire us? And the other part of it, I call your attention to, is that he attained it through living the gospel fully in all aspects of his life. And so we look at Frederick, and Claudia read the prayer, it really starts to identify some of those, the meaning of all aspects of his life. And we see that he's a son, he's a student, he's a founder of the society, and he's a friend. One of the important things that Frederick was known for is he was a great friend to many people. He's a husband and a father. In his career, he was a lawyer. He involved himself in politics. He was a professor. He was a scholar. He was a journalist. He wrote for newspapers all the way back to when he was in effect, high school, all the way through most of his life, an author of major scholarly works. And most of all, if you had to ask him, he was a Catholic. So through all aspects of his life, he attained holiness. And we'll be looking at some of those parts of his life and seeing how that holiness came through. One of the lines in Fidelis Leci that probably John Paul was most known for, most quoted for, is this one. He says, there cannot be two parallel lives in your existence as laymen and women. On the one hand, the so-called spiritual life. On the other hand, the so-called secular life. I remember when our bishop in Madison went to his ad liminem meeting with the Holy Father, he came back saying this a lot, which means that in his meeting with the Pope, this was probably one of the things they discussed in terms of the lay involvement. Interesting enough, Frederic Ozanam, in a letter near the end of his life, writes to another longtime friend, Charles Holmes, and says, we are not blessed with two separate lives, one for seeking the truth and the other for putting it into practice. Almost saying exactly what the Pope would say many years later in his apostolic exhortation. And so Frederic Ozanam really did live that life where he didn't live two separate lives separately. So in part 2 of the rule, we understand that Vincentians are called to journey together towards holiness, because true holiness is perfect union with Christ and the perfection of love, which is central to their vocation and the source of their fruitfulness. So we can see that dedication of Frederic Ozanam to the vocation of a layperson, first being that towards holiness, really is filtered down to us. I know we have talked frequently in the society why people join the society. You know, many of us join first to help poor people, to help people in need, to put our faith into action, to live out the Good Samaritan or Matthew 24. But then we discover the friendship and the spirituality. But right from the start, the founders and Frederic Ozanam were very clear that the reason for the society was that we ourselves may be journeying together towards our own holiness through living out the gospel. At several points during this, I'm putting up some questions for reflection. When you may want to use some of these later on if you do a retreat or an evening of reflection, but we won't discuss these, but just to think about it as we look at this first part of the presentation and think, are we able to integrate our faith with all aspects of our lives? Maybe even a harder one, are you able to talk about your Vincentian values or your faith with your family, friends, fellow workers? And are there people that you know who just live that out? People who live their faith openly in all aspects of their lives. It isn't always easy. We know that. And so looking at Frederic as an example, we have someone who models this for us. So I'm going to move on into something about Frederic, starting with his early years. He was born in what I would call dark and revolutionary times. He was born in 1813. Previous to that, the revolution, the French Revolution, was from 1789 to 99, absolutely chaos. All of the institutions were dissolved. If the monarchy, the church, the educational institutions, hospitals, industry, almost everything was thrown into chaos during that time. And they came out of it slowly, followed by a coup d'etat, and eventually Napoleon, through his war efforts, becomes recognized as a national hero and figure, and he sets himself up to be the emperor. Napoleon's reign ends right about the time that Frederic was born. So it's a time what came before him of absolute disruption. And so we have Frederic being born in 1813 in Milan. So just a little perspective. He was born in Milan because at that time, France, a major part of France did include that part of Italy. And Napoleon had conquered it. And so his parents were truly French, but they were living in Milan. His parents were Jean-Antoine Ozanam and Marie Nantes. So both families were well situated before the revolution. The Ozanam name, which trips up a lot of people, that's just not a very French name, is it? It actually has Jewish roots, and the root of it is Hosanna. And they're part of a group of people that were converted very early on in the French history to Catholicism from the Jewish faith. They were well established, though. So the Nantes family, his mother Marie's family, were actually very prosperous silk merchants in Lyon. Lyon was a silk manufacturing capital for many years, and her family were very prosperous. But they lost all of it in the revolutionary times. His father, Jean-Antoine, was an interesting man. He fought with Napoleon in Italy. And in some of the writings on his biography, they talk about his father. And there are great stories about his father fighting with Napoleon. There's stories about his father actually once having to take off with several other soldiers, kind of deserted for a few days because Jean-Antoine's parents were being held captive by some of the revolutionary forces at the time. And he took off and rescued them, brought them back, and returned to military service. And he had a heroic military career, but as the Napoleonic era wrapped up, he did not see his career as being a soldier. And so he went, first he had some business opportunities, he and his wife did, and they started recapturing the family fortunes, but they made a bad loan to a relative and lost whatever little nest egg they started to acquire. So Jean-Antoine then went into pursue a medical degree in Milan. And he was a very talented doctor. Throughout his whole career, he was always a doctor that also served the poor. He was a doctor in a hospital. He has his own clients. And when his father died, Frederic had to take care of the family estates in the paperwork. And he found that about 30% of the father's bills were all written off helping poor people. So it's a rich tradition that Frederic inherited. The family, though, really, as Italy became divorced from France and the politics changed, they wanted to remain in France. So they moved back to Lyon, where the Marie's family had been from originally, in 1815. Frederic was the middle of three sons. The family was a close-knit family. They had little nicknames. Frederick's mom called him Derek. The father called him Fred. But they also were a family that had a lot of tragedy. There were 11 other children who died, including 2 sets of twins. So a lot of sadness in the family. And Eliza, whose picture is down on the side, died at the age of 19. So she lived long as Frederic knew her, was very close to her. She died when Frederic was about 8 years old. And so it was a tragedy that he felt personally. It was very close to her sister. So only 3 boys, Alphonse, Frederic, and Charles, lived into adulthood. I put a picture down here of Guigui, who was a dedicated housekeeper for 3 generations of the Ozanam family, and would move with Frederic even after he was married to Paris. So it was a close family, but it certainly suffered. Alphonse was a priest. Alphonse first had a medical degree. Kind of like Frederic, we know the story that Frederick's dad wanted him to become a lawyer, but he wanted to become a professor, right? So he first, when he got his law degree and his doctorate in law, he also worked on getting a degree in literature. And it wasn't until after his father died that he actually started pursuing a career as a professor. Well, Alphonse had a similar track. And I think Alphonse was even more of a problematic child than Frederic was. Alphonse wanted to be a priest, but even in this very Catholic family, the father didn't want him to be a priest. And so he followed his dad's wishes and became a medical doctor first. So Alphonse has a medical degree first, and then went on to pursue becoming ordained. Charles, the youngest of the living sons, pursued a medical degree. And he was a homeopathic doctor in particular. He published a lot. And you can even find on the internet some of his papers today and some things about him. So it was a close family that Frederic came out of living in Lyon. Frederic was often ill as a child. Several times he suffered from bouts that were terrible. there's a cute story in one of the biographies of he was just sick for days and days, and his mom fed him some beer and he recovered. So one of the family stories that got passed along. His parents were also committed to serving the poor. I mentioned the father being a medical doctor and writing off a lot of the bills. So we had a good example. The mother participated in something called the Night Watchers. The Night Watchers were a group, very often women, who would sit with dying people just to be there, to be a presence as they were dying. Cute story about the parents. They both in Lyon, because of the work they did, were in the slums, which were as bad in Lyon as they were in Paris. And very often those houses, had rickety stairs. They weren't well constructed. And at one point, the two parents both agreed that they weren't going to go any higher than the 6th floor because they were afraid of the stairs could collapse and someone would be harmed. And so one night, the story is told, they met each other coming out of opposite doorways higher than the 6th floor. Apparently had a good laugh about it and went home. But unfortunately, it was one of those stairways that collapsed and was the beginning of the end for Frederic's father. So they were a good reason for being concerned. Frederic attended preparatory studies in Lyon at the college, the Royal College of Lyon. When you see the word college referred to in this period, it's not a university college. That it was like a high school. So that was what preceded university studies. So Frederic attended preparatory studies in Lyon at the College Royal de Lyon. He was a good student, well liked. He was fluent in French and Italian, Greek and Latin. He says his father would converse and pray in Greek and Latin, sometimes reading scripture. But like many young people, he had a crisis of faith when he was a young man, when he was 15 years old. And, this isn't dissimilar to many people that I know. Maybe you have family members too that are like this, but many people, they stop studying their religion after they get confirmed, right? They don't read it, they don't go to classes, they go to mass maybe, but eventually they go on and become lawyers and doctors and teachers. They have careers, and they still have their 8th grade theology and wonder why it doesn't work. And Frederic had that same thing. So he writes to a friend when he was about 17 years old, and he looks back and he says, by dint of hearing talk of unbelievers and unbelief, I began to ask myself why I believed. I read all the books containing the proofs of religion, and I could not find a single one that satisfied me. I was saved by the teaching of a philosopher priest. He put order and light in my thoughts. From then on, I was reassured in my faith, and touched by such a rare blessing, I promised God that I would devote my life to the service of this truth that had given me peace. At 17 years old, I think it is really here he puts a stake in the ground. And it really is a commitment that he keeps through his whole life. He really wants to teach the truth of Christianity throughout many different aspects of his life. And this Father Joseph Nero will reemerge in his life later on. He's the one who introduces him to his future wife, Amelie. He knows Frederic well enough to comfort him later on that, no, you don't, your vocation isn't to be a priest. So this man was an important friend and mentor to Frederic. So a couple of questions to think about is, on your journey, do you occasionally have doubts or find it difficult to practice your faith? And how do you get back on track? And, are there people in your life who help you during these times? Frederic had such a person, and even though he had a strong family of faith, that he still had doubt. And I think a lot of his, like I said, as he became more and more aware of other aspects of life, he outgrew his naive theology, but was fortunate to have a priest who would share that faith and bring him up to date. So this might be a time I take a little pause if there are any questions or comments before I move into the next aspects when he moves to Paris and starts his study at the university. Claudia, are there anyone that have any comments or questions?
Nothing yet. I think people are just really soaking it all in. I didn't know a lot of this early history, so this has been fascinating for me. Thank you.
Great, good. I'll keep moving on. So when Frederic graduated from college, or what we would call high school, his parents weren't too keen on him going to Paris for a couple of reasons. One was that there was one of the several minor revolutions that came during Frederick's lifetime in 1830. By the way, I didn't mention in the beginning that the times were so tumultuous in Frederick's time. He lived through 11 different types of regimes during his life, starting with Napoleon. Then he had a monarch. Then he had an emperor. Then he's had democracy. Even the people who wanted royalty couldn't decide which kind of royalty they wanted, an old line or a younger, more progressive line. So they had riots and revolutions in Paris. So his parents wanted him to stay. So he worked as 2 years as a law clerk in Lyon while Paris calmed down. Bit of an irony is that there were as many riots in Lyon during some of that time with some trade silk workers revolting. So it wasn't totally peaceful. But the other thing was he was sensitive to the need of his family. Alphonse was off to Paris, much like he was there a lot of his life, kind of the family rebel. But during that time in 1830, one of the sets of twins had just died. And so it was a tough time for his mother, certainly. And so to stay close by was a good thing for him to do as well. So he stayed in Lyon. And in 1831, Frederick does go up to Paris to study at the university. And his father wants him to be a lawyer. So he first goes to law school. Adjustment to the big city was difficult for Frederick. At that time, Christianity and Catholicism was tolerated. It was suppressed violently during the Revolution, but it slowly came back through the Napoleonic time and then afterwards. Sometimes for very practical reasons. Sometimes it was just never very deep away either. A lot of people don't know Napoleon's uncle was the Cardinal of Lyon. So it wasn't that far away. And the Daughters of Charity, many of you heard the story, they were actually brought back by Napoleon, actually for very practical reasons. He needed nurses in his hospitals. He had a lot of wounded soldiers that needed taken care of, and no one did it better than the Daughters of Charity. So, but at the university particularly, they kept Catholicism and Christianity at arm's length. That was the one place it wasn't very welcome. So these college students at the University of Paris often found that the professors mocked Christianity and made it difficult for them to practice their faith. He also went to an odd boarding house. Contrary to some things you may read other places, he never lived in Bailly's boarding house. For some reason, his mom picked a boarding house not far from the Sorbonne, right behind the Pantheon. And it was a co-ed place. Many of them were kind of working class people. There were men and women there whose talk was rough. They served meat on the fast days, which, by the way, wasn't Friday then, it was Wednesday and Saturday. And so he was kind of out of sorts in his living situations. There weren't many students there, and it wasn't much to his liking. He complained a lot about it, but interesting, he was only there for 2 weeks before he moved into Ampere's house. But this was a whole later that same year. By the way, the college year started in November. It didn't start when ours does in September. Some of that's to do probably with an agricultural society. Wait till the crops got in, right? So schools started in November, early November. But in December, after being in Paris for a little while, he writes to an old grade school friend of his. Actually, he says, "Paris disgusts me because there is no life, no faith, no love. 'tis like a huge corpse to which I, young and alive, am chained, whose coldness chills me. Yeah. Why don't you tell us what you really think, Frederic? So it was not easy. And it was not easy for a lot of our original founders who all came from rural communities where Catholicism still was much more accepted than in the big city. But fortunately, he visits André Marie Ampère, the famous physicist. Those of you who studied physics or electricity, you know about amps. This is the guy, the physicist who discovered the principle that the theory with amps. So it was a tradition, though, for visiting people to a new city, especially young people. They'd visit people from their own city with letters of introduction, just as a courtesy. It was a small enough place still that they would do that sort of thing. And so he went to visit Ampère and finds that Ampère is sympathetic to his situation, and he invites him to stay with him because Ampère's son has gone to Germany to study, and there's a spare room, and the two kind of hit it off. So in a letter, November 12th, you can see Frederic hasn't been in town that long. And he talks about how much better this place is. We were on our pilgrimage to Paris, some of you know, a couple of weeks ago, and I showed him where the original boarding house was and where Ampère's was. And it's about a block difference. He was talking about, it'll be much closer and more convenient. Well, but it was an environment where he could have meaningful discussions with a very knowledgeable, faith-filled person. He even draws in one of his letters to Father this little diagram of his house and the garden outside. So he found a good place to live. And he would live with Ampère right up to the day before our society was founded. Our society was actually founded on a Tuesday after Easter. He's intent to move out at that point, just a couple of years into his college career. But he wants to get through Easter, Holy Week and Easter, staying with Ampère, and then he moves in with some of his Lyon friends. So he finds a much better place. Frederic, as a young student, meets important thinkers and artists and politicians of the day. Couple notes about this. Some of these names, like Lamennais, he's a very prominent priest politician, had very solid but radical ideas that were very favored by students, suppressed though by Gregory the 16th eventually. So Lamennais falls out of favor. But Ozanam certainly has met him in the salon sessions and discussions. Chateaubriand, not the food, but he was a noble politician, and he came from Lyon too. So Frederic actually does another visit to Chateaubriand, who's a very prominent person, politician, and it finds out that Chateaubriand actually had read one of Frederic's defense of Catholicism that he wrote when he was in high school, and so he knew who Frederic was. Count Montalembert is another Catholic with royal background, a very progressive thinker, and Father Lacordaire, who's he's Frederick's first biographer, and he's the refounder of the Dominican order after the revolution in France. His name will come up a couple times during the talk. Now, some might wonder, how did he get to see all these people? What is it about Frederic? How did he? But to understand maybe the social dynamic of the time, Paris wasn't that big of a city to start with. And when you narrow it down to who the middle class was, it becomes an even smaller group. He's part of the professional class. All of the founders, except one, had fathers who were medical doctors. So it's a group who are firmly in the middle to upper class. And when you take that middle class group and narrow it down even further to Catholics, it becomes an even smaller group. So for Frederic to have met some of these people isn't as extraordinary as you might first think, but he also must have had some warmth or easygoingness to be able to talk to them, to meet them. Very often they had discussion groups. One historian talks about Paris as this time as the age of discussion. Very often on Sunday evenings, there'd be meetings at people's houses, and people just come in and discuss the topics of the day. Some of these people Frederic probably would have met in those environments. So Frederic, though, as a young student, does get up the courage with several other students to challenge some of the very anti-Catholic statements that the professors make. And at one point, he circulates a petition that's signed by many other students that has a well thought out rebuttal of statements by this Professor Joffrey, which he takes. And I should recheck my facts. It's been a while since I gave this talk. I think Joffrey eventually converts, but he certainly backs off some and accepts that these young students did have a point. And then also by doing this, Frederic starts to emerge as a leader amongst the group of people who are willing to put their faith into action and certainly live it out in this environment that's fairly hostile. A couple of years later, he writes to the same fellow, Falconet. He says, they want to make a sort of leader of Catholic youth in this country. A fair number of young people hold me in an esteem of which I feel totally unworthy, but it does show that he starts, and this is after our founding, so you can see that it's on many fronts, though, that Frederic is becoming the leader of a core group of people of faith attending the university. And once again, that is a theme of the Holy Father in this apostolic letter. He says, young people are and ought to be encouraged to be active on behalf of the church as leading characters in evangelization and participants in the renewal of society. So once again, Frederic is that model I talked about in the beginning, the model of Catholic lay people. And as a young person, you can tell that every aspect of this particular sentence, Frederic actually lived it out. So we get to the part of the story that is pretty familiar to all of us. Frederic meets some like-minded students, and he meets Emmanuel Bailly. Emmanuel Bailly is the older of the original founders, and he had this boarding house. He had been part of a group before the 1830 revolution that was suppressed. There was a small group called the Congregation, and many aspects of that group were very similar to what our society would eventually become. But he, after it's suppressed, he gathers some of those principles and starts having discussions again in his boarding house. It's the Society of Good Studies. And it's meant to support young Catholic students in this environment, allow them to have good discussions with each other, as well as eventually have discussions with people who weren't of the faith. And it's there that he meets Lamache and Lallier on Italian Day, and they become good friends. So here's the part of the story you all know. It was at one of those meetings that at the Conference of History that included some people that are hostile to the Catholic Church, and a Saint-Simonian challenges the members, saying something like this, reportedly, that Christianity did wonders in the past, but it is now dead. You who boast of being Catholic, what do you do? Where are your works? To that, Frederic responds over the next week or so, really taking it to heart, and said, what must we do to live our Catholicism? Let us no longer talk so much about charity. Let us put it into practice and go to assist the poor. So this becomes the root of the founding of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Now, one of the things I like to point out at this venture in terms of these discussions is these discussions were probably fairly heated. These were serious opponents they had. Those of you who've seen Les Miserables, for instance, when that revolution in that was suppressed, that was only a few months before. Frederic was in town during that, and it was only about 9 months before we were founded. So, of course, that's a work of fiction, but Frederic was there. And those are the kind of young radical students that probably attended these discussions. So the other thing I'd like to point out at this point, however, is that the willingness of Bailly and Frederic and Lallier and Letelier and Lamache to have these debates and have these discussions, I think is significant, because in many ways, Frederic didn't found the society, those guys did. If they had never been challenged, they would just continue having nice discussions till they all graduated and went off to the countryside. And I think very often we don't have those kind of discussions, do we? We don't have discussions with people who don't think just like we do. And when we do, we don't respect them. And in this case, Frederic took it to heart. He wasn't defensive. He didn't say, "Oh, you're all wrong, go to hell. I'm not listening to you guys." And he said, "You know what? You make a good point." And so I think there's a model there for both active discussion with people we disagree with, as well as a model that says that we need to be in dialogue with people who don't think like we do, because they'll bring us to a better place. So that better place for those students was April 23rd, the week after Easter that year. 6 college students met on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are a common theme here. They gathered in Emmanuel Bailly's office to form a new organization, a conference of charity. So here's a picture of San Sulpice. It's right down this street here, off to this side, that Bailly had his printing office. Just a little bit about why there. He didn't have them meet where the big discussions were, or in his boarding house. And I think part of the reason why is he wasn't too sure about this group. Again, thinking of the radicals in Les Miserables, the police and the church, they weren't all that happy to have young groups of college students meeting together. And Bailly didn't want to risk his bread and butter house if this thing went bad. So they met there. They only met there for about a half a year. Then Bailly moved his printing office to another location and moved out of that. And then it did move into his boarding house. By the way, all 6 of those other people have very interesting stories. Frederic is called the principal founder, and more in our society, we've realized that he isn't the founder. Each one of those men had an important role in the founding, and many of them played roles that were important to how we formed ourselves and who we are today. So starting with the change of the rule in 2005, we started referring to Frederic more and more as the principal founder. And he was that. What he did, I'll talk about a little later on, his role was significantly different than the rest, but they were all important and interesting. So Emmanuel Bailly sent the students to Sister Rosalie, who gave them direction and resources in their efforts to help the poor. And she also really tutored them in the spirituality of St. Vincent de Paul. Emmanuel Bailly and Rosalie both were very steeped in the spirituality of St. Vincent de Paul. Emmanuel Bailly's brother was a Vincentian priest, and he almost became superior to the Vincentian order after the revolution. So Emmanuel Bailly was very familiar with Vincentian spirituality, and so was Rosalie. Now, Frederic is, contrary to what you may read some places, Frederic is not the one who went to Sister Rosalie first by Bailly. That were 2 of the other founders. Certainly Ozanam knew Rosalie. Certainly he probably visited with her often, but we have no letters that are between Sister Rosalie and Frederic. So there are other people that are actually probably much closer to Rosalie than Frederic. Doesn't say anything about either of their relationships, but several people like Devoe and Clavet actually knew her before the society was founded. And Le Prévost, who comes later, was very close to her, as was Bailly. But she certainly did teach Frederic and all of them how to go to the poor. She provided the names for cases. She had vouchers for firewood and food. And so she was also someone who should be considered as a founder of the society. We would not have existed without her tutorial. So again, a set of questions, who were the people who took time to mentor you as a young person? We've all got those people. I could list the names of priests, of high school teachers, a Moravian minister who mentored me. And I hope we all remember to pray for them now and then. They made us the people we are. And also a challenge to all of us of how do we encourage and support young people of faith in our lives? We're the Sister Roseleys, we're the Emmanuel Baillis today. I said several years ago, I'm no longer Frederic, I'm no longer Lallier, I'm the older gentleman. He was only 39, wasn't that old, but we have to see more and more that our role really is to be mentoring, to be supporting, to bring in young people, to listen to their ideas. And I'm sure Bailey looked at these guys and he thought they were crazy, I'm sure, for some of these things. One of the things he didn't get appreciated for enough is he kept them out of trouble with the local police, who really weren't supposed to allow gatherings. He's the one who kind of made sure that the church people, the parish priests, understood what was going on. So we all have to have that role of encouraging and supporting young people. So a little bit more, and then we'll take a break and see if we have any questions. So one of the things our rule talks about 4 different parts of Frederick's spirituality, and one of them is that he sought to renew faith among all people in Christ. And so he writes this letter to his fiancée, Amélie Sulacroix, in 1841. He's off in Paris, they're engaged, she's still living in Lyon. And he's thinking about the society. He says, can we not believe without too much madness that divine providence calls us to the moral rehabilitation of our country, when 8 years are enough to raise our numbers from 8 to 2,000? He keeps saying 8, it was 7, that's a different story. But this book by Matthew Brijon-Lavergne that I've got the cover of is a fascinating history of our founding. And one of the claims that Matthew Brijon has is that he quotes people that say, really it was the Society of St. Vincent de Paul that refounded all of Catholicism in France. It renewed the entire church. These young men went out in parishes all over France with energy and a faith that really renewed the church. And so Frederick saw the society as something that also increased the faith of the laity, not just helped the poor. And the Holy Father very clearly references this need for re-evangelization. It was the same in Frederick's time as it is now. He says, when whole countries and nations where religion and Christian life were formerly flourishing are now put to a hard test as the result of a constant spreading of an indifference to religion, of secularism and atheism. Only a re-evangelization can assure the growth of a clear and deep faith and serve to make these traditions a force for authentic freedom. That certainly describes the environment that Frederick was working in after the revolution. And I think it also describes the conditions in Europe today, and in many ways also the United States. And so Frederick does provide us a model for re-evangelization. And it was more than the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Some of you have heard about the Lenten sermons, the Lenten lectures at Notre Dame. We've talked about that in some of our orientations. But in 1834, a couple of years after our founding, 3 of our founders go to the Archbishop and propose that there be Lenten sermons, progressive Lenten sermons to young people at Notre Dame. And they wanted Father Lacordaire to do those. Well, the Archbishop liked the idea, but he wasn't so sure about Lacordaire. He's kind of a young progressive guy, wasn't sure to be accepted. So he had 4 of his top monsignors do it instead. It bombed, quite frankly. But the young man came back the next year and says, come on, let's have Lacordaire do it. And the Archbishop did agree to that. And so Father Lacordaire was asked to preach. He was reputed to be an excellent preacher. I've read some of his sermons, and they're flowery and they would not satisfy today's tastes at all, but apparently they were very popular amongst young people of the day. So it was attended by over 5,000 people, including many of the most prominent people of Paris. Ozanam and others had to go in early to reserve seats. And he continued that till 1850. Now that series, with interruptions with wars and other things, was continuing even until today, until the recent tragic fire. I was in Paris several years ago, actually during Lent, and I walked by the front of Notre Dame, and there was this big sign out front saying the Lenten lectures as started by Frederic Ozanam. And you can see on the right, was a bulletin from the parish that Sunday. So it was a tradition that kept going on. And the purpose, though, was evangelization of young people. Now, Frederic was also an active member of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. Some of us older members may remember pagan babies, an odd way to do missionary work in hindsight, but it was something many grade schools had. But it was started by another woman from Lyon in 1822, and Frederic really had that strong missionary presence, so much that he was the editor of their annual journals for 10 years. And there's a period of time in which we actually have more letters to the president of the Propagation of Faith than to the president of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. So it was something that Frederic, even as a busy professor, was very active in supporting. So this point, we're at a time he's graduated from college with his bachelor's in law, doctorate in literature. He's back in Lyon, and he's had a lot of time to think. And this will be the last section, Steve, before we take a little break questions here. But a lot of us are familiar with the set of letters that he addresses, where he raises the question of the social question. He writes first to Emmanuel Bailly. He says, "Let us work to increase and multiply, to become better, more tender and stronger, so that as the disorder in the society becomes more and more apparent." He says the social problems, the conflicts between poverty and riches, between self-interest which wants to take and self-interest which wants to keep. The confrontation between these two self-interests will be terrible if charities does not interpose, become a mediator, if Christians do not dominate with all the force of love. This is the beginning of a set of important insights that Frederic has. One is the role of the society to not be on either side, but to put ourselves between the people we serve in poverty and the people in our family and people of riches and wealth in our parishes, whatever, to really promote a gospel of love, of understanding, of charity. So the word that he uses, the social problem, probably a lot of people give Frederic credit for starting Catholic social teaching. And this word is one that is all through the Catholic social teachings of Leo XIII, the social problem. And Frederic is one of the first to use that. But I think, given that there's these salons and these discussions, probably just something that was in the water. It was probably something that was not uniquely Frederick's discovered, but he really crystallized it in these sets of letters and his teachings for a number of times. Now, interesting enough, that a lot of people know that part of the letter, but they don't read up earlier in that letter, same letter to Bailly. And this is so Frederic. He says, "I visited Saint-Étienne." That's a town. It's a big industrial silk town. He says, "I visited Saint-Étienne, where I saw industry in all the apparel of its most laborious works, and carried away a sad impression. Considering to what horrible toil millions of men apply themselves to put bread between their teeth and procure opulent well-being for a small number of the fortunate, and how the intelligent must be brutalized and the heart hardened in the midst of those machines and the immense deployment of material force." Frederic didn't come up with this notion of the social problem out of his head sitting in a room thinking. He did a home visit, but this time he did a home visit to a factory, right? And by going to Frederic, his whole life, he went to places, not just the poor, but to this factory. And this is what gave him the strong urging to address this question when he saw the conditions. This is an element of the Holy Father's letter. He says, it is necessary then to keep a watchful eye on this, our world, with its problems and values, its unrest and hopes, its defeats and triumphs, a world whose economics, social, political, and cultural affairs pose problems and grave difficulties. This is the field in which the faithful are called to fulfill their mission. And Frederic certainly did keep his eye on those conditions, didn't he? It was 10 years before Karl Marx would write his manifesto. It was 55 years before Leo XIII started introducing Catholic social teaching. And Frederic Ozanam was already providing an assessment of the struggle between rich and poor, laborers and industrials. He believes the split isn't between political systems or monarchy or democracy. He believes that Christians have a duty to get involved. And so I won't read each one of these, but he's so passionate about this. If you read his letters, he writes to two more people. 2 weeks after, he goes to Bailly first, but then he goes to Laie and he writes another letter talking about the social question, the struggle between rich and poor. He waits 2 weeks later and he writes another long letter to another friend, Jamon. Jamon is the artist who drew some of those early drawings of Frederic and one of the later ones. He had first communion with Jamon. Jamon's in Rome at this point. And again, he talks about the social problem. He does a beautiful job threading a needle, not condemning either side for who they are, but saying it really is a time that we need to insert our Christianity into this social question. So we come to a period of time where, Frederic he's got his law degree, he's got a literature degree, he's got a doctorate in letters, he's got his doctorate in law degree. He goes back to live in Lyon. That's where he's writing some of this from. And he's studying for a law degree remotely in Lyon, and we go back to Paris once in a while. So at this point, Frederick's torn between, let's take a little break here. I think this is the spot I wanted to take a little break before we go into the next part. So,
well, we do have a couple of questions for you, and I'm going to take you off a spotlight so you can see the people here. But one of the first questions was, in your study of Frederic, which has been a labor of love really for you for many years, what do you consider the most surprising thing that you learned?
Oh my gosh.
Can you stop sharing your screen for a sec, Ralph, so that we can go to
yeah, sure.
gallery? Thanks.
Come on, it's not popping up. Oh, my stop share screen's not working.
That's okay, I got it.
You got it? Okay, thanks. I probably got to end show then. You got it?
Yeah, I'll get it in just 1 second. Okay.
Okay. There you go.
Okay.
Maybe some of the most surprising is a part I'm coming to, how he deals with disappointment in his health. I think probably is the thing that I've been most attracted to him, that doesn't get talked about a lot, this acceptance of things going wrong. But he also is he's a bridge builder, I think, is the other thing that I see in him. One of the first biographies of him is called My Friend Ozanam, and another is called The Great Friend. He had ability to make friends, and by making those friends, he brought people together under a common cause, and he did that with a lot of passion. But he's a person who always needed to be around people. He needed to have friends and family.
That kind of almost segues into another question, and it's kind of a two-parter. Someone's putting a lot of thought and taking your words very much to heart about Frederick's life. How do we ignite that fire in the Vincentians and our conferences to engage in the role of renewal of faith in our parishes, and more particularly, how to engage young people with this same fervor?
Right. We need to have zeal ourselves, I guess, and we need to be willing to share that this is exciting work. when you see how Frederic engaged the first people, some of them described that he approached them with passion in his eyes, and they could hardly refuse him. And I don't know that we invite people with that kind of passion that they can hardly refuse us. The problem with young people actually emerged very early in the society, maybe even before Frederic was dead, but as it went on, that Frederic will talk frequently about maintaining the primitive spirit. And some of that has to do with not getting too regimented, that we only do this, we only do that way. And to have new people join, be they young or not, with new ideas, and not say, oh, we tried that once and it didn't work. Or just, or just say, we don't do it that way. That's not how we do it. Those are all turnoffs, and people say, oh yeah, okay, fine. And then they disappear on us. Other elements are just engaging people right away, as much as we want the holiness and spirituality. Going out on a home visit gets people. I've had several people who kind of hung around the edge. After they went on 1 or 2 home visits, they were hooked. They got it. And so if we're not finding ways to, and it might not be the home visit right away, it might be serving at a food pantry, it might be visiting a prison, it might be working on not everyone's called to do all of the same work, I understand that, but to engage them with people as fast as we can, I think is what we need to do to have people really want to be part of us.
So you mentioned that a lot of the references lately are saying that Frederic was considered the principal founder. Were there other members that weren't as involved with Frederic, or did he just step into the leadership role? He lived servant leadership, so to speak?
Well, a couple of things. One is he after the confrontation in the debate, it really was his idea to let's do something different. He himself does credit L'Italian Day with the idea of starting to serve the poor rather than just these debates. L'Italian Day is an interesting fellow. He studied law, but he hated these debates. Matter of fact, he didn't like participating in them at all. He didn't like confrontation. There's several other times in history he also is not happy with confrontation. But Frederic, it was his idea. It wasn't clear to Frederic until this happened that was the right way to go. But then, it was DeVoe who had the best relationship with the founders with Sister Rosalie. Lallier is the one who probably wrote most of the original rule of the society, working with Bay and Frederic. He was an interesting fellow. He went on to be a judge. He was kind of a serene, quiet, thoughtful man who became Ozanam's best friend. And Ozanam's daughter, Marie, he's the godfather of Marie, his daughter. And Bailly was certainly important. So they all had a role, different roles. And then some that came after were very significant too. When they all graduated and went to Lyon, 5 of the original 25 people were from Lyon. And that's a whole nother story for another time. But that split with some of those college students going to Lyon really was important for the forming of the society. It showed that it wasn't just a Paris thing.
Okay. So some people I know don't really like going into the chat. So I'm going to ask you if you can unmute if you have a question. Raise your hand and I'll call on you, or unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like of Ralph.
Yeah, Dean looks like he's raising his hand.
Dean, please go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
What kind of religious spirituality did he live? There's a lot of emphasis on his works of the poor, but what about his church life, his prayer life? What did he do for his own personal spirituality?
He's a man of constant prayer. Certainly went to mass regularly, but it said even when he prepared his lectures, before he went off to the university, he prayed. He prayed every morning. We have actually in Paris, they still have the little stand that he prayed before, and the crucifix he prayed off. So even before he gave his lectures, he was a man of prayer. Certainly prayed the rosary. And he also found other people of faith all the time to join with him. So he had a rich prayer life. He also just talks about praying with his father in Latin and Greek, and certainly later on when he was married, he and his wife frequently had prayer time. So, and that's documented.
That's great. Anyone else? Stephen, you have a question. Unmute, please.
Yeah, you were talking about the priest and philosopher that was a mentor for Frederic. Have you ever done any reading about him and what it is that what he actually said?
No, and it's probably private, but he was a professor at that college in Lyon. He went on eventually to Paris, I think. He's a known entity. I just have not studied him yet.
And maybe, that leads to another question that just popped up here. How can we model ourselves after Frederic and the role that we as Vincentians have about mentoring younger people to sustain our society? Granted, it's been around for 186 years, so we don't expect it to, or 187, we don't expect it to go away tomorrow. But by the same token, we do want to, keep our legacy going.
Multiple things. I did at the University of Wisconsin. We had a conference and we reactivated it. Some of my most enjoyable times were attending their meetings. I took them on home visits too, and two of them actually became Catholic priests out of that group of 15 to 20 when we started it. I went on home visits with. I went on home visits with the priest who's now my pastor. So that's one way, just to include them, involve them, and also to do some things with them socially. Also, things like we always make sure on our local council, for instance, we have a high school group and a college group, and we always bring about 10 or 15 of them to national meetings. We pay their way, we get them there, and that creates some enthusiasm and new leaders. So sometimes you have to invest some money, some resources, some time. And it can be frustrating because they come and go. I mean, my conference has had young people, and gosh, they go off and get married, and then they get jobs in other towns. It's not a one and done sort of deal. It's a constant effort to befriend them and to make room for them and make room for their ideas.
I think that's a key point. You really are driving home there, that new ideas. And
I remember with the college students sometimes too that we had some men's housing in the conference. They really they understood that this was fully their society. They were a full-blown conference, and they once or twice a year would go to the men's housing and have a cleaning day, and they drove me crazy because I'd be, they'd have no organization. They where are your rags? Where's your cleaning supplies? Whatever. And and then they don't worry. So I remember one time I was over at the place. It was like they're supposed to be there at 9. It's 1 minute after 9. Oh, come on, where are they? I had everything except. Sure enough, they showed up 10 minutes later. They'd already been to Mass. Several of them had to go to confession after Mass on a Saturday morning, and they got some breakfast on the way. And they had 20 people. So my kind of sense of organization was different than them, but it works. And my normal regular conferences probably wouldn't have gone to Mass at 6:30 or 7 in the morning before a cleaning day.
You always start with prayer.
Yeah.
So, anyone else have a question for Ralph?
Well, let's dive back in, and we can have some more time at the end.
Great, thank you.
So we get to a period that Frederic Ozanam is uncertain of which way to go. He's torn by the desire to teach literature rather than practice or teach law. Lacordaire wants him to be a priest and join the Dominicans. He's committed to seeing the society expand and grow. He's not sure if he should marry or be a priest. He's not even sure if he wants to stay in Paris or Lyon. So everything's kind of on the table and very confusing in this time. But he starts practicing law. That's what his training was. He had a doctorate in law even, and that's what his father wanted him to do. There's some interesting letters he writes about his first cases. This is his very first case. He said, I had a petty case, my debut. It is about opposition to a marriage by parents because of the insanity of the future husband, who indeed had the most stupid appearance you could imagine, but who does not appear in any way devoid of intelligence when you converse with him. So that was his first case. And but he sees more and more that it's not a practice that he wants to be in. He writes to Lallier, he says, justice is the last moral haven for contemporary society. To see it surrounded with corruption is for me reason or indignation, each instant renewed. I almost always return from court deeply disturbed. I can no longer resign myself to behold the evil which is allowed to go on. So he's obviously seeing it as a career that he does not want to compromise himself to be part of it. And the Holy Father says that lay faithful should also hold in high esteem their professional skills. He says, the moral courage, without them, there is no true Christian life. And so Ozanam really lives that out and struggles with it. And he says a year later, he says, I cannot get used to the atmosphere of chicanery. The discussions of pecuniary interest bore me. So Frederic then is asked to teach in Lyon. And he's appointed as chair of the Department of Commercial Law at the University of Lyon in February. Lyon really wants to keep this talented man in their city, and they look for ways to do it. They also offer him to start teaching some literature too, because they know that he has an interest in that. So he does both for only about a year. And Lyon really did want to keep him there. But the interesting thing is that commercial law was important to Lyon because they were the capital of silk industry. Rouen up in the north, they had the iron works, and Lyon had the textile works. And the Industrial Revolution was a little later in France than it was in England and America. And they were under Napoleonic law. Any of you are familiar with that know it's pretty different than other forms of law. And Frederic was actually forming new ground for commercial law under Napoleonic law in his lectures, and it was needed in Lyon. Actually, one of the quotes, and this goes to not living two separate lives. Many of us are familiar in our Voice of the Poor activities with this quote. It says, charity is the Samaritan who pours oil on the wounds of the traveler who has been attacked. It is justice's role to prevent the attack. That actually is something he taught in his commercial law class. This wasn't something to church people or the members of the society. He has interesting things on, he calls not minimum wage, he calls it a natural wage. He writes very progressively on fairness of hitting the balance between the owners of industry and the workers. So he does a lot in that area, but it's a very short time. Well, the other interesting struggle he has is with whether to marry or not. And some women don't find this amusing. Some of us find this amusing. But Fred is a young man struggling. And so he writes to Lallier at 37, says, it could be that there is some unjust disrespect for women here, you think? Well, the Blessed Virgin Mary, my mother, and some others bring me to pardon the daughters of Eve many things. I admit that in general, I do not understand them. He goes on in another letter to talk about, he said, he cannot help but shedding tears at weddings. So he's not really finding a vocation to marriage at this point in his life. But his father dies that same year in 37, actually visiting poor patients when a stairway collapsed. And his mother dies a couple of years later. And it's in that environment that Frederick's probably most at a loss. He's not with his friends in Paris. The college students are spread out all over the country. He certainly writes them. And many of his friends, even in Lyon, have married and they have families. And so he's a bit at a loss. And it's Father Noir again, who says, Frederic, you're not meant to be a priest. That's, quite frankly, could be more loneliness, more things that you really need to be around families. And so he keeps setting him up to go visit. The head of director of education for Lyon is Monsieur Sulacroix, who has this daughter. I think Noir keeps hoping that Frederic meets her or sees her, and he does, and falls passionately in love with her. And he doesn't just fall in love with her. He also really accepts the whole family. We have a lot of letters that he writes to his mother-in-law that are very affectionate and very friendly. So he writes to Lallier now several years later in 40, he says, you must find me completely infatuated, head over in love, but I cannot hide it. Although sometimes I laugh at myself. I really thought I was immune. So he moves on and marries Amélie Sulacroix in Lyon. His brother presides at Mass, his younger brother serves, and it's attended by her parents and friends. And he writes Lallier again and has this charming letter and said, Lallier does not attend the wedding. So he writes him afterwards and says, I would have presented you my charming wife who has been given me. She would have greeted you two with gracious smile, which claims everybody. And now for 5 days, we are together. What calm and serenity in this soul who has been known to be so upset and so ingenious in finding how to suffer. So as a layperson, he really finds his role in married life. And we're finding out more and more about Amélie. Our national council's in the process of having translated and publishing a book that's available in French on a biography of Amélie and some of her letters to him that are very interesting. They have trouble getting pregnant. She has at least one miscarriage. He goes off to Paris for 1 year to begin with and leaves her in Lyon until he gets settled. Then she joins him in Paris and has some difficulty being pregnant, but they do have one daughter, Marie, born in 1845. And he writes this, he says, I waited the day of baptism with great impatience. She was baptized at Saint-Sulpice in Paris. We shall begin her education at the same time she begins ours, for I am feeling that God has sent us our baby to teach us many things and to make us better. And any of us with children, we kind of understand that, don't we? So he certainly loved his daughter. And it's also something that the Holy Father mentions in that same letter, that line about the domestic church. He says, children as living members of the family contribute in their way to the sanctification of their parents. He hasn't had kids, that sometimes it doesn't feel like sanctification, but I think we all do grow in love and understanding through the children we've been blessed with. So Frederick's at this point in his life, in the midst of a career. He's married, he's got a daughter. He starts teaching that commercial law I talked in Lyon. He's invited, though, to come to the Sorbonne as a temporary position and lectures there. And that's, well, a professor is ill. That's only lasts a year after, but he moves to Paris to take that. He moves from a very stable, good income job that some of his family questioned why he would do it, but his wife went along with it. Then he has to teach for 1 year at St. Stanislaus prep school. But then in 43, there's an open seat for a professorship of literature, and it's a competitive, secret kind of application. One of the first times they did it, apparently. And even though Frederick's young and Catholic, he wins it, hands down, and becomes a full professor at the Sorbonne, where there really aren't very many Catholic professors, certainly not professors who are willing to show their faith. As a matter of fact, there's another professor who is being railroaded out that Frederick has to defend at several points because of his faith. But it's known that Frederick was a popular, well-respected lecturer. The university was controlled by the government. The Catholic Church could run what they call these prep schools or colleges, but they were not allowed to run universities. And the French were especially suspicious of the Jesuits, I'll tell you that. That keeps popping up in literature all over the place. But Frederic was fluent in languages. He certainly knew French, Italian, German, Latin, and Greek, but he also knew Spanish, English, and he read Hebrew and Sanskrit. So I wish. It's not my forte. But he certainly did, again, practice that faith life, that he didn't separate and have two lives. This is in his lecture notes, believe it or not. Again, this isn't something he wrote. He said, so he probably even said this to one of his classes at some point. He said, I am not here to theologize, for I have not the honor of being a theologian. I confine myself to my profession of historian and critic, which I will exercise in a Christian manner. That means that I bring my personal convictions into play, that I do not conceal them. One of the biographies, Fred tells a story. One day, apparently the Sorbonne outside the class had these big placards and signs with the name of that day's lecture and who's giving it in these big lecture halls. And one day, one of the students put a different sign up and said, sermon today by Father Ozanam. And that may have been the occasion for Frederic to have this discussion with his students. But he writes to, again, the same friend of his that he's maintained. We've seen his letters to him before. He says, with never the need to dissimulate or water down my convictions, I have always met with a sympathetic hearing from the young people in my courses at the Sorbonne. I continue to strive for that alliance of the science and faith, of the church and freedom, which I hope to see emerge from the storms of the 19th century. So he's a model in professional careers for all of us. And I think, I talked about being models. For many people, it's tough to have that faith in their work life, to be willing to talk about faith, not in an evangelizing way, but just that it's part of you. I had a model in my life of my father. Just a little sideline. My dad was a head electrician in a factory. In summers I worked there. And one summer I worked in his department. One lunchtime, I saw him chew out some guy. I think the guys in the factory swore all the time. I mean, that's just, but around my dad, they all knew not to swear. And I saw him chewing out one guy who was, 45 years old, just like he was me. He said, I thought you were a smarter man than to use language like that. So, but we all may struggle with that, but Frederic didn't. Frederic really was able to integrate that with his students in a tough environment with a professional university that frowned upon that. So we moved to 1848, and that's a significant year in France and in Frederic's life. Protests of the tightening policies of the government of King Louis Philippe leads to riots in February 1848. So much so that Louis Philippe resigns, and a democracy is formed, a republic is formed, and they have an assembly that has elections. Frederic actually is nominated not from Paris, but from back in Lyon. They nominate him for the National Assembly. And you can read a letter that is basically his campaign position statements. And some of the clearest writings we have by Frederic on his thoughts about things like fair wages, healthcare, all sorts of things like that are in that platform. He was a strong advocate for liberal Christian democracy. Most Catholics at that point wanted monarchy. They really weren't firm believers in democracy. But Frederic was a citizen. He served in the National Guard during those revolutionary riot times. He was on the side of law and order. So he was also a publicist in this time, especially. He started a newspaper with Montalembert called L'Ère Nouvelle. It's the New Era. His brother Alphonse gives him a hard time. He says, it's not the new era, it's the new error, or new errors. So Alphonse isn't that big a fan of these liberal ideas. But he regularly published articles promoting the views of truth, democracy, and faith. well, going back, the man Louis Viol was that newspaper, by the way, let's see if I can get back to it. He was the editor of L'Univers. That was a newspaper started by Emmanuel Bailly, and this man was a convert to Catholicism and actually a member of the society. He was very conservative, and he regularly would be debating Frederick in these two newspapers, going back and forth. And Frederick was often the object of his scorn. Some of the articles we know that Frederick wrote, we have the things like The Causes of Misery, From Help Which Humiliates to Help Which Honors. Out of that, a lot of us are familiar with some of the quotes from that. The Dangers of Charity, on legal charity, and one on socialism. So he was a published author, and he thinks very deeply about some of these issues of the day, and he's well read, well respected. Well, 1848 does not end well. One of the things that happens is Ozanam himself, with Emmanuel Bailly, and Cornudet, who's the other vice president of the society, they're actually being outside the Senate as National Guards together. And they get the brilliant idea that maybe they could quell some of these protests by having the bishop, Archbishop Afra, who's a big supporter of the society, by the way, go on the barracks. Sister Rosalie had done that several months before. She'd gone on top of the barracks and said, "Go home, I have enough poor in my hospitals, stop creating more poor people." And they did. And so they think, well, if the bishop did this, that'd be great. Well, the bishop did do it, much against the advice of the general, the leading general of the time, and much against the advice of his monsignors. But a stray bullet kills him. He takes a bullet and he dies several days later. That's a crushing blow to Ozanam that he really thinks about for a lot of the rest of his life. And Napoleon III gets elected as president, and he has all the tendencies of his uncle, Napoleon I, and slowly that goes from elected president to emperor, something that happens all over the world, we see even today. And in April, the next year, April 1849, the newspaper L'Air Nouvelle folds. So it's a tough year. It starts with just a lot of enthusiasm for democracy, for liberal politics, and it ends with an emperor and repression. So this is one of the interesting periods, I think, though, that Frederick really shows who he is to me. And we don't talk about it a lot, but many of us live lives that this can be a model for. So in 1849, the newspaper is just folded. We've got the emperor, and Frederick writes to his mother on Saturday before Easter, on the eve of Easter. He says, "When the head is worn out with work, and the heart is by controversy and disappointment, one leaves the petty rivalry of men and contact with wicked passions to aspire to the peace of these holy days." So it's the beginning of a process of accepting providence, accepting that you don't get to necessarily have everything work out the way you want it to, but you still have to trust in God. This was written a little earlier, but it's also one of my favorite examples of Ozanam talking about providence. The background of this is the Gobelins was a well-known tapestry factory. Sister Rosalie sent her young women there all the time for jobs. In Spain today, even now, they call tapestry Gobelins. And this is the place that created all the tapestries for Versailles and the royalty, these big, massive ones. And he says, and so if you've ever, maybe to understand it, just to add to it, have you ever looked at the back of a tapestry? There's all these threads and strings. It's a mess. But when you look on the other side, it's a beautiful picture. And that's what he's referring to. He says, "It is we ourselves who are working out our destiny on earth unknown to us, exactly as the craftsmen of the Gobelin work at their tapestry. Let us work on this earth, docile and submissive to the will of God, without knowing what he is accomplishing through us. But he, the divine artist, sees and knows." What a wonderful image for all of our lives, that we don't know necessarily the good we're doing. We don't know what the big picture is, but we do our small part, just trusting in God's providence. So Frederic, now in 1851, he's getting older, but he's still reflecting on the times. And this is another one of the passages that I think very often gets used, especially as important in this environment we all live in today. He says, "What a stormy but instructive era. We will perhaps perish in it, but let us not complain about having entered it. Let us principally learn to defend our convictions without hating our adversaries, to love those who think differently than we do, and to recognize that there are Christians in all camps, and that God can be served today as always. Let us complain less about our era and more about ourselves. Let us be less discouraged, but let us be better." Could almost end the talk with that and the environment we're living in today. Frederic really was able to have some perspective on the disappointments and accept that God's hand is still working. So in 1851, he resumes active teaching, but his illness starts to affect all aspects of his life, such that he eventually stops his teaching. And he writes again, he says, "As soon as I attempt to do any work, my terrible weakness is apparent. I do not know how I shall finish if I do not regain some strength. But God, who sent me the sorrow of ill health, leaves me the joys of the heart. I bless him for that lot." So poor health forces Frederic finally to withdraw from teaching. Periodically over these years, he's taken some sabbaticals. He's gone to do some writing with the permission of the university, taking some time off, but he suffers pain and fatigue. He travels some with the family for relaxation, solitude. He goes to a spa in the Pyrenees. He goes to England in the summer of 1851 with Ampere's son, who becomes good friends with him. They look at the World's Fair that's there with all the technology. Interesting enough, they go there, leave little Marie at home. Frederic and Amelie go there with Ampere's son. Frederic gets bored real quickly. This is a major event, a major technology. He gets pretty bored though and starts visiting conferences in London, especially the conferences that are working with the poor Irish that have come to the city. So same thing in the Pyrenees. He's at a spa. He starts feeling a little better. He forms a conference with the people at the spa. So wherever he goes, he's still promoting the society. And that's part of why he's the principal founder. He has that passion to keep on encouraging people to start new conferences, to stay true to the primitive spirit. As we grow and change, very often it's he who works with new structures, new way of thinking, but all the while also still wanting to keep that primitive spirit that welcomes young people, that keeps true to the Holy Spirit. So on the bottom, he visits Gascony and Spain even. He visits, here's a picture, he visits the birthplace of St. Vincent de Paul. They give him a little leaf from an oak tree that Vincent allegedly planted. So he does some traveling, hoping to get better, but he still is suffering. In 1851, he writes Dr. Joseph Arthon. He was one of the 5 members of the first 25 founders that is from Lyon, and goes back to Lyon and starts some of the first conferences there. Interesting man, he's a psychologist. Better not get too far down to talk about it, these wonderful people he's friends with, but Frederic writes him and says, "I am demoralized. Give me a fresh heart. Pray for me so that if God does not wish me to serve him by working, I resign myself to serving him by suffering." Amazing that Frederic has that deep insight, and the Holy Father talks about that deep insight as well when he talks about the laity. He says, and once back to the theme of the vineyards, he says, "Even the sick are sent forth as laborers into the Lord's vineyard. The weight that wearies the body's members and dissipates the soul's serenity is far from dispensing a person from working in the vineyard. Instead, the sick are called to live their human and Christian vocation and to participate in the growth of the kingdom in the new and even more valuable manner." And as we ourselves get older, as we have parents that get older, as the people we serve have that, it's important to find ways to see that our productivity or usefulness really is not lost, that there's still important work that we can have to do. So after he leaves his spa in the Pyrenees, or right before leaving, he writes this. He says, "It's a great trial for me to see my work suspended and my career interrupted, but we must learn how to make sacrifices when God demands them, to ask them for the grace to do his will on earth as it is in heaven." We're progressing even further. Holy Week, I think, is when he wrote this in 1853. Now, that's the year he will die, remember, in September. So this is a half year before he dies. And he's reading scripture. Someone's asking about his, I was asking about his prayer life, and he reads scripture regularly with his wife. Matter of fact, there's a book called The Book of the Sick that I helped make sure was translated into English several years ago. He and his wife put together a whole set of scripture readings, Psalms, Gospels, all scripture readings that would be supportive and encouraging to people suffering and who are ill. And so they prayed the scripture daily, and they had a list of their favorite ones that became this book, commonly published afterwards. But after praying scripture, passage from the Old Testament, he has this reflection. It's almost like a Kubler-Ross stages of acceptance, isn't it? He says, "Must I leave all those good things which thou hast given me? It is written in scriptures that I am to do your will." He talks, this is the abbreviated thing. He talks about, if I gave up all my books, if I gave up this or that, would I get well? That's it's a longer quote in between the dots there. So after going through a list of things that kind of bargaining with God, he comes and says, "It is written in scriptures that I am to do your will. I have not the right to complain. Thou hast given me 40 years of life. If thou were to chain me to a bed of suffering for the rest of my days, it would not have sufficed to thank thee for the days of which I have lived." So he's in Italy at this point. With his wife not doing well. He's there. He's has friends and family around, but even there, when he gets a little spurts of energy, he's working on starting conferences, and the Duchess of Tuscany was kind of against the society. There was these liberal ideas. She wasn't sure where it would go, and so Frederic actually met her and talked to a local priest, and he writes this priest. He says, "I've seen the society do much good, sustain the very many young men in the practice of virtue, and enkindle wonderful zeal. We have conferences in Quebec and Mexico. We have them in Jerusalem. Why then not have a conference in Siena?" Well, shortly after, they had 3 conferences, including a college one in Florence and Siena and in the Tuscany area. So even, this is literally months before he's taken ill and dies. So again, a set of questions, looking back, can you see how the Spirit led us to our place, this place in your life? Do the disappointments, tragedies, or setbacks we've experienced test our faith in God? And to look, even whatever our circumstances are, how is God moving in our lives right now? Things that Fred certainly self-reflected on. He didn't just think these things to himself. He wrote. The reason we know about these thoughts is he wrote to friends about it. He was struggling, but he was also sharing his pain and his struggles to really assure others that even though he was suffering, he was still strong in his faith, and he was searching for ways that he could share that faith. So Frederic died in September 8th, 1853 in Marseille. His 2 brothers both came to Italy, where he was staying, and were with him. I mean, he wanted to die in France, and so they took a boat. They didn't get very far. They just made it to the port of Marseille, and he was brought to a house there and died shortly after. His last words were, my God, have mercy on me." So they had a funeral masses then in Lyon, and then his body was brought to Paris, and there's another funeral mass at Saint-Sulpice. He's buried at a crypt in St. Joseph de Carme. When we had our pilgrimage last week, we actually had a mass right in this chapel. It's an interesting story. Lay people were not buried in churches. His wife Amelie really thought, though, that he was a significant person that should be not buried in the cemetery where her family was buried, but in someplace special. And they kept the body for a while in Saint-Sulpice. And they, through the intervention of Father Lacordaire, they brought it to this, what was a Dominican monastery or priory. And it was actually done in the secret of the night. They checked with the police, and the police basically said, "But we don't know, it won't hurt us." So a couple of people actually had to sneak his body into this church and be put in this crypt where he is now. And the story is that Amelie wasn't able to visit for several years because it wasn't a cloistered, a male cloister, but it was Pius IX who actually gave permission for her and Marie to visit him now. So two final things. One is Frederic wrote what he called a final will. And it isn't a will like today where you give away your stuff. It's kind of a final, more like the testament part of it. And one paragraph, he says, "I die in the Holy Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church. I have known the difficulties of belief of the present age. If I set any value on my research," again, Rice the scholar, "it is that it gives me the right to entreat all whom I love to remain faithful to the religion in which I found light and peace." Certainly words that we all can live by. As we know, the church isn't perfect. We've all struggled with the scandals. We all have our disappointments, but just like Frederic says, here is still the church that he hopes people stay with. And Father Lacordaire, then I'll have the last word. He wrote the first biography of Frederic, and he says that God wanted him to have the heart of a priest while living his life in the world. That describes him accurately. There was not a Christian in the France of our time who loved the church more, felt her needs more keenly, or grieved more bitterly over the faults of those who served her. Again, a wonderful reflection that I think we all can take to heart as we try living out our Catholic faith. Frederic is that role model that teaches us to accept a flawed church, a church that Frederic knew was flawed, but he still found that he loved it even while he grieved for it. The clause for Ozanam for canonization was introduced fairly late. If you look at it, it was over 100 years after he died. That's another story why it took so long, but it didn't help that it was introduced so late, because all of the witnesses and a lot of the documentation that goes in the process were far removed at that point. But Frederic was beatified in 1997. And we're waiting for final canonization. Just to report, some of you have heard this before, but we are very hopeful. There was another miracle that has been approved by the local diocese. It came out of Brazil, the story of an infant who, from ultrasounds, was showing no mass for brains, or the spine just ended with nothing. And an abortion was recommended. The family had good spirituality, were Vincentians, and prayed to Frederic Ozanam. And weeks later, they went back, and the doctor was prepared to consult about an abortion. And certainly at that point, they found she was normal. And the doctors had no explanation, and were willing to testify that they viewed it as having no medical or natural causes. So that has been submitted to the Vatican, and we're waiting for the Vatican's medical experts to look at it. And we've got the possibility of that being accepted and things moving forward. So thank you, Claudia, for praying for the canonization at the beginning. And at this point, we have a little but not much time. I've talked a lot tonight, apparently. So I can stop, Claudia, if you would make me stop sharing, and we can have some questions.
There we go. And again, thank you so much, Ralph. A couple of questions that came in. One is, what is the most relevant parallel or commonality that you see between Blessed Frederic Ozanam and St. Vincent de Paul?
besides their obvious Catholic faith.
It's the easy one.
A love for the poor, really seeing that the poor are their masters and that their faith would be nourished by a relationship with the suffering, whatever that kind of suffering. It isn't just poverty, but suffering of many kinds. They were very different people in many ways. Frederick was probably a much better scholar than Vincent. Vincent was much more practical than Frederick, but they both. The other thing maybe is that they had the zeal to motivate people to join in following them and creating these organizations. And that may be the biggest unique thing about both of them is their zeal. They believed in what they did, and other people were attracted to work with them.
Interesting. One comment that came up, but related to something that you had talked about, the tapestry. Jim Noe, who's a past district council president here and still an active fundraiser to help start our dental clinic. He said, tapestry is a wonderful metaphor for St. Vincent de Paul's special works, as the results don't show the hours of planning and implementation.
Nice. Yeah, I find that a wonderful parable that he shows.
So I'm going to put this in gallery view, and does anyone raise their hand or want to unmute themselves and ask anything of Ralph? This is such a privilege to have you here, Ralph. We know you're a little bit jet lagged, a lot late. But I know that Sister Paul, who I saw her here earlier, there she is.
Hello, Paul.
There she is. So I know that she mentioned when she gave her presentation during our early on in our Tuesday with Vincent, the presentation said, as long as you still were on the face of this earth, she would never be giving a presentation on Blessed Frederick, because she cannot light a candle to your knowledge and passion for his life and his work.
We had a delightful time. She was in Paris with us on pilgrimage and did a wonderful time talking about Rosalie and Louise and how all these people were relevant to the same kind of thing I've been talking about as role models, that they really inspire us to live our lives today.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Well, Stephen, I think we're going to keep on time here. We're going to maybe not let people out early, Ralph, but at least we'll get them out on time.
Getting close to landing on time. Good.
I'd like to, if it's okay, I've got sort of a closing prayer that I'll share. I share my screen.
Stephen, your audio is kind of getting funky.
Sorry. How's that?
Much better.
Is it better? Okay. Oh, you know what? I know what I can do. Hold on.
No, that's great. It's great.
Okay. When I get done, I just want to. I've got a litany in honor of Blessed Frederic Ozanam that I'll share, and maybe we could go through that together. But what is the most inspiring thing for me, or the thing that motivates me out of tonight is, how can we get our Vincentians and get young people to take the risk of being radical, like Vincent, like how can we create the environment for that radical zeal to believe that they can actually make a difference? And when you're reading the part about when Frederick was talking about his time, being born into his time, that, why complain? But it is something that he can do something about. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's really, that is what will fire up young people, is to give them something meaningful, let them, explain it to them in such a way that they realize that they can make a difference, and then be there to support them. So I don't know, anyhow, I guess it was more of a statement than I carry a soapbox with me, Ralph.
Sister Paul wants to comment.
Can you
unmute yourself, please, sister?
Yeah, we had a young us in Paris from, is this South Dakota, huh, Ralph?
Yes.
and Andrew.
Yes.
And they're a wonderful young couple who, she's a convert, who decided that they had to actually get involved in something that was meaningful to themselves and to other people. And that's why they entered the society. And they when Ralph asked for comments about the tour, the pilgrimage, that's what the young woman shared, is that they decided they just had to do something that was meaningful for themselves and for other people. And that's why they joined the society. And when they said that, I said this prayer inside myself, may they never hear the words, "This is the way we've always done it." A wonderful.
He was the diocesan president of his council.
Yeah.
So
Wonderful young.
talented young couple.
Yeah.
Ralph, we may have to ask you back to give us the whole thing about the founders, because I found that, sir, the collective founders, not just, like as you said, the focus on Frederic as the principal founder, because I think there's a lot of entanglements and interesting politics from that time.
Well, it's one of my favorite talks to give, and I happily do that, because one of the things I discovered is a lot of the little things that are part of us today had their roots very early in the environment of our founding. And so it's interesting. We have a very interesting history as a lay organization founded by lay people. And times weren't always easy, but we had talented people all through that history.
All right. If it's okay, what I will do now is share screen.
Yes.
If we can go through the litany. Ralph, would you like to lead us through it?
No, please go ahead. I've talked enough.
We don't see it yet, Stephen. There we go.
Okay, you got it?
Mhm.
Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
Lord,
have mercy.
Christ, hear us.
Christ,
graciously hear us.
God, creator of the world, have
Have
mercy.
mercy on us.
God, Son, Redeemer of the world,
have mercy on
Mercy
us.
on us.
God, the Holy Spirit, the Sanctifier,
Have
Mercy on us.
Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception,
Pray for us.
Saint Vincent de Paul, Father of the Poor,
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Defender of the Faith,
Pray for
Pray
us.
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Promoter of Hope,
Pray for
Pray
us.
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Apostle of Charity,
Pray
Pray
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Exemplary Husband and Father,
Pray
Pray
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Lover of Poverty and the Poor,
Pray
Pray
for
for
us.
us.
Frederic Ozanam, Advocate of the Dignity of the Human,
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Pioneer of the Social Doctrine of the Church,
Pray
Pray
for us.
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Servant of Truth,
Pray
For us.
Frederic Ozanam, Model for the Catholic teachers and professors,
Pray
Pray
for us.
Ozanam, Exemplar for authors and journalists,
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Mediator for the Catholic lawyers,
Pray
for
for
us.
us.
Frederic Ozanam, Lay Missioner,
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Faithful Son of the Church, pray for
Pray
him.
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, Initiator of the Collaborative Ministry,
Pray
Pray
for us.
for us.
Frederic Ozanam, model of courageous commitment.
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, grand figure of the Catholic laity.
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, example of Christian holiness.
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, founder of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul.
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, disciple of St. Vincent de Paul.
Pray for us.
Frederic Ozanam, our intercessor at the throne of God.
Pray for us.
Let us pray. God, you raised up Blessed Frederic, setting him ablaze with the spirit of your love, to encourage groups of lay people in the service of the poor. The Father, we may carry out your commandment to love, and so become like peace. We ask this, Christ.
Amen.
Amen.
I'd like to thank Ralph for just being so absolutely gracious and giving us a gift today. Hopefully, we'll be able to have copies of the recording for people to go back and review at different times. It was dense with information, and I just want to thank you, Ralph, so much for your time and effort.
It was my pleasure. I enjoy sharing, and thank all of you for tolerating 2 hours of history. My wife says, "You're not going to go 2 hours, are you?" But you all seem to hang in there, so I'm happy to do it.
Tell Kathy we hung on strong, so. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Our next First Tuesday will be in December, and we look forward to your participation then. We'll send out more information in the Vincentian newsletter that hopefully you're all getting, and we will continue to pray for the canonization of Blessed Frederic Ozanam and hope that the Vatican will approve the second miracle. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you,
Good
Ralph.
night, everyone. God bless you.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Thank